In the beginning of this cycle of Lenten readings for Sundays, we have the fall of man, and that actually is ancient with regard to the cycle of readings, for in the monastic life, traditionally, already at the beginning of Septuagesima, the fall of man, the creation and all that goes with it, comes in. They're sung, meditated upon in the weeks before Lent actually begins. And there is a reason for that. Easter is the putting right of what went wrong, and if we are oblivious of the fact that we're in a mess, then we enter into that mode of pride, which is precisely the origin of the fall of the demons who want our harm. And so our truth is what we are, as indeed we are reminded on Ash Wednesday, dust. And the returning to dust is precisely the consequence of original sin. Death came into the world at that point. In Paradise Lost of John Milton, we have that dramatic portrayal of the moment of disobedience when Eve pulls at the tree and gets the apple off. Milton has this one-liner: "Earth felt the blow." Now, it is interesting that it is the serpent that we find inviting her to do that. It's also interesting that we find that serpent in New Age language, based there in the discipline of these bodily positions where at the base of the spine they have the serpent power. That's interesting, and one wonders where it's coming from. So the serpent is still at work trying to use nice things to do us harm, and that also is picked up by St. Paul as he writes to the Corinthians that we have to do with an angel of light. He tempts us with apparent good. As regards the reading that we have from the letter to the Romans, it is specifically adjoined to that from the story of the fall of man, precisely because it presents Christ as the second Adam. Adam, we are told, prefigured the one to come. But the gift itself considerably outweighed the fall. And we have an echo of that on Easter night when, quoting St. Augustine, we have in the Exultet, "O blessed fault, or felix culpa, which merited for us such a Redeemer." Now, the main thrust of the first Sunday of Lent is the fall of man put right with regard to the battle against the one who caused it, in the conquering of Satan in his own warfare, temptation. And therefore we have this hand-to-hand combat which we find in the Desert Fathers, for the same reasons, in a sense. If one is low in human resources, empty, hungry, weak, then the devil can have a field day. But the Lord willingly underwent this in his humanity. There are interesting lights given to Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich with regard to some of the details of these temptations. We have here only a skeleton in the Gospel itself, but whether or not it's true what she saw, it is fascinating to see what she saw. The devil was very ingenious at using means of getting the Lord to compromise. And that is the force that we have to do with. Hence it is that we need to have some knowledge of discernment of spirits. This has been expanded by the Christian authors over the centuries, and it's something that we could look at for a few minutes today, because the Gospel can be read on several levels. But one of them is precisely the fact that the devil was a personal presence acting on different faculties of the Lord, or trying to, and that he's going to do the same thing to all those who serve him throughout the centuries. He is somebody who wants our harm, and essentially so because of his envy and hatred, jealousy. He does not want lesser beings to occupy the place that he has forfeited. And his minions are all the time switched on, whereas we are happily dormant. They are tempting us when we're dozing. And so we need to have that notion of spiritual combat. And all spiritual authors underline the importance of being fully aware of what we have to do with. Specifically, the Ignatian spirituality has a whole system of looking into what's going on inside the soul, and also of controlling what's going on in the life of the person forever, insofar as there is the whole discipline of daily examination of conscience, which has actually come through even in the monastic life, influenced by it in subsequent generations, because even in our own monastery we had the double examination of conscience, and it's in many a French monastery to this day. The one at midday, around the time of the Angelus, still in choir, is for the particular examination, l'examen particulier, in which over a month a particular virtue is examined, and whether there is progress or regression in its practice, or it might be a vice to be combated. And the general examination at Compline, in which there's also a long pause, l'examen général, that looks at the general thrust of the day. And one talks sometimes about the glance, le coup d'œil, in which immediately looking back one sees whether there's anything big. It's rather like a cork. It bounces up to the surface of the water immediately. If there's something there big enough to confess, then it comes to the mind's eye, and these are the things that at the end of the week one confesses in confession. Hence it is that one sees immediately a person who prepares a confession and a person who doesn't, because a person who doesn't often go to confession has nothing to confess, whereas a person who goes often has normally a certain discipline of preparation and is aware of far more. It's rather like the difference between a nurse who is always putting her hand in very powerful chemicals to clean them, and the worker who works on the road and digs holes. One more clod of mud doesn't make any difference, and he won't feel it. So let's have a glance at some elements of this discipline of spiritual combat. We know that it was a providential moment when St. Ignatius was wounded and had to be placed in a situation where he could do nothing but read. And he found things happening when his will to be a great soldier, and therefore a star in worldly terms, before the glory that he saw in the lives of certain saints, for he had access to their lives in a little anthology, was quite different in its effect, because one had an immediate satisfaction but then left the soul empty. The other, when it led to thinking of the glory of these saints, had a different effect, and far more peaceful and consoling on a deeper level, and became the basis of his discernment of spirits, what was of God and what was purely of the world, the flesh and the devil. So we have these spiritual exercises coming in, which will have an impact on generations and generations of young souls in particular, and influence many lives towards glory in heaven and conquering Satan on earth. So exercises in view of conquering oneself, and regulating one's life. Also, in view of avoiding the pitfall of coming to some determination through any inordinate affection. In other words, seeing where even internal movements are coming from. So, a method is actually offered, which, with God's grace, teaches and helps one to overcome oneself, one's unruly passions, and by gaining control over every conscious act to acquire inward peace, a method of self-conquest and self-government. And when handling people who are discerning, one looks for this divine signature, inward peace, not just on the superficial level of the emotions near the surface, but on the deep level of the will, what in French is referred to as la fine pointe de l'âme, the fine point of the soul. There is a deep point, the deepest point of all, on the level of the will, which, when handed over, espouses the divine will, and then may be gently invaded by grace, which can then control through it all the levels of the being, including actually even the body, because the pacified will is seen. A person who is tense can be detected. Look at the forehead, look at the expression, look at the eyes, look at the way he speaks. Whereas the pacified person, resting in the peace of the Blessed Trinity and espoused to the divine will, is at rest in harmony with the will that moves and rules the cosmos. As long as we're fighting against that will, we're bound to be in an unpeaceful mode. A general idea of the exercises can be gained from this summary. It's based on a progression which actually includes the theme of this Sunday's readings, our origin and our fall. Our truth, therefore, has to be found. So, the truth about the first foundation, it leads us in a short time by the way known as the purgative way, to acknowledge the ugliness of the sins which have caused us to stray shamefully from the end. So this has the effect of cleansing the will from inordinate attachment and therefore freeing it from serious sin. Before that happens, we're still in the mud and we can't move, we're stuck. And what a blissful time the demon is having in many a country right now, where the correct practice of the sacrament of penance has been more or less hijacked in view of something which actually doesn't really have a good effect on the soul. In some places we have penitential services which are not actually having the effect of forgiving mortal sins because they're not being confessed. And it doesn't leave a deep peace on the soul. The soul is still a bit agitated because it somehow knows it hasn't really gone to confession. And when that's massive in a country, the church in that country is underneath in serious trouble because there's a cancer there. Massive, unconfessed, mortal sin. So that's the bottom line. Nothing can happen until that's handled. Then, setting before us the example of Christ, our King and Leader, there is this invitation in what is termed the illuminative life, that is, we're being enlightened by grace, to avoid the devil's standard, his banner, and to follow the standard of this very good and wise chief. The famous meditation on the two banners, the two standards. Under which army do we want to be enlisted? And to imitate his virtues. Notice that there is this centrality of Christ, and the Jesuits do cultivate the imagination so that the will may be warmed by seeing something mentally and then be influenced. The devil himself cannot directly influence the will, but he can play on the imagination. By doing so, he indirectly affects the will. So it's as well to be aware of the power for good and for evil of the imagination. St. Teresa of Avila refers to it as the mad woman of the house. Indeed, he almost forces us to do so by the meditation of the three classes or grades of men. So we have these three categories. 1, those reluctant to follow Christ. 2, those eager to do so, but with limitations. And then, last of all, those bent on following him at once, wholly and always. Now, a little parenthesis here. We can be dismissive towards other Christians at times, thinking that we've got it all. We have it all potentially, but we must not be presumptuous in thinking we have it all in the realm of sanctity. There is sanctity around. And the reason for it is this. The Lord is interested in the will, and when he finds a will orientated towards him, he is free to act. Whereas in a structure which in itself is complete, but the will is not handed over, he is not free to act. Hence it is that one finds genuine sanctity in those who have an incomplete truth, sometimes, but the will is completely faithful to what they have. Now that's why we have to respect, for instance, the many millions of brethren we have who are united with us in baptism but have an incomplete theology, but have, for instance, a moment in their life when they hand over the will. Therefore we respect the work of the Holy Spirit in what we refer to as born-again Christians. Why? Because the moment in their life when they handed over their will to their Saviour was important. And if it's not withdrawn, the Lord is Lord of their will, and therefore he has access to them. So we must be careful in any way being presumptuous and taking a judgmental role when looking upon these many, many beautiful souls which the Lord sees in their entirety and their mystery. We do not see it all. What we have the right to is to look at ourselves, especially in Lent, and see, am I being faithful to this great light I have? These resolutions are strengthened more and more in the third week. Notice that the optic is getting towards a resolution, and it's called an election. So we have in this third moment, again, the imagination being strengthened, cultivated and harnessed, the sight of Jesus Christ walking before us with his cross. Now this is his banner. And notice also that that joins us to all our brethren across the world. Why? We have to do here with relationship with a person. Very evangelical. Follow me. Lastly, in the unitive way, which comprises the fourth week, he enkindles in our hearts a desire for the glory of Jesus risen. And in these spiritual exercises there are physical hints, such as in this week to walk on the side of the road where the sun is and not in the shade, indicating how Ignatius had understood fully the impact of the senses. It creates delight, and that influences the will. That applies to all areas where we have to do with souls. Creating an atmosphere which delights influences the will. So, to create beauty in church, e.g. with music, is not indifferent. We collaborate with the power that made us, for God is order and beauty, and the space where God and man meet must be beautiful and healing. To this are joined annotations, additions, preludes, colloquies, examinations, modes of election, rules for rightly regulating one's food, for discerning spirits, for the scrupulous, for thinking with the Orthodox Church, and so on. The whole, if applied in the prescribed manner, possesses the incredible strength of leading one to solid virtue and to eternal salvation. Now, with regard to the notion of temptation, the devil knows where he's likely to succeed. Remember that he has all his faculties still functioning 100% with regard to intelligence and the knowledge that he had as an angel, and these are brighter than what we have, so he has an advantage. It's just that his will is corrupted and ours is not totally lost. It's an error, the Calvinistic error, to talk about the total depravity of man. They're in a bad state with regard to the way they look at man. Ours is more balanced. All was not lost at the fall. Our reason still functions, and we are wounded. But total depravity is actually going a bit too far. The Lord took on our humanity. Therefore, it's not totally depraved. With regard to what the devil does, he knows where the weak point is, and that's where he'll strike. So we need to be aware of it as well. And we also need to be aware of what's likely to favour his action. Right now, many pious souls are unaware of how exposed they are to his direct action, especially when they open a screen. He is there waiting for admission, and we give him admission just by the touching of a key. Also by the way in which a soul normally protected by prayer and grace is easily wounded by a shock, more than others, by facing the unexpected or hearing the unexpected, because there are unpleasant messages all around in the air. So we are not less but more at risk than before. Therefore we need to be fully armed and be fully aware. The youth in particular are more at risk than anyone else, and the devil knows the power of certain things to influence them. One great one is music. So we need to be aware of all this, especially in any way when in contact with young people who might listen to us, because they're not aware. I just conclude. The battle is extremely serious and the stakes are grave. They do not end. And therefore the devil, by making sure that no one thinks of the gravity of the stakes, e.g. perpetual distraction and numbing of the soul by the same, is fully aware of how to get at us. For those of us who are in prayer, it's important to know that we're a nuisance to him, so he'll find the means of making sure that we're only half functioning, and he's very clever at doing it.